All right, everyone. Hello, this is PR. I'm with MAs and PhDs, and this is the second part of my Bhabha lecture. The first was a very kind of, you might say, a kind of introduction, which stressed just to give you a kind of basic idea, a kind of intuitive sense of what Bhabha means, particularly by hybridity. And I was, just to recap, I was talking about magical realism and how I think, it strikes me, I'm not as well informed about magic realism as I am about other kinds of fantastic literature, but to me, it strikes me as the paradigmatic example of hybrid literature, one in which the very nature of magic realism hinges on the absurd incompatibilities and paradoxes that beset the post-colonial condition. All right. And that's why I mentioned the story Moheshir Mohajatra by Parashuram, which uh, I recounted the story. And please, I apologize for my coffee, but I need it. Yeah, I mean, I recounted that story. Didn't really explain why I stressed the story in the context of Bhabha and hybridity. You see, I think it's a perfect example of the fractured nature of episteme, of identity, um, of culture in post-colonial countries, because there is a kind of uprooting of the formerly integrated individual from their own cultures, from their own follies and foibles and superstitions of their own cultures, and an immersion into a knowledge system, a worldview that in many ways is different from our own. I think who is it that puts it very well? Lata Mani puts it really well in her book called Contentious Traditions, uh, where she says that colonialism is a conflict between, or a coming together of, differently freighted rationalities. Differently freighted rationalities. That's not to say that the West is rational, the East is irrational. The West is scientific, the East is mystical. We have our own forms of rationality. The West has its own forms of mysticism. Uh, but but they are differently freighted. They are accentuated differently. They have different histories, these traditions, and there is an extent of epistemic violence. There is an extent of cultural uprooting caused by the colonial conflict, and there is an extent to which the colonized individual, or even the post-colonial subject, is someone whose um, psyche, someone whose sense of cultural identity is fractured, is hybridized, often in problematic ways, or in disturbing or in troubling ways, by this conflict or coming together of differently freighted rationalities. But one sec, my laptop is overheating, so I'm just going to go and switch the air conditioner on. Just give me 1 minute. Sorry about this. Okay, so where was I? So that's why I talked about Moheshir Mohajatra, and that's why I talked about magic realism. Okay, to give you a sense of the incorrigibly plural nature of the post-colonial reality and its irreducible complexity and hybridity, and the everyday nature of the absurd and the bizarre and the fantastic in our lives. Okay, can everyone hear me, by the way? Is everything fine? Audible? Unmute yourselves.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Okay, so now I'm going to start my PPT on Bhabha, and I begin with a little picture that makes the argument of science taken for wonders, I think, very, very obvious and very simple. Can you see my screen as yet? Hold on. By now you should be seeing my screen. Done. Or you can open the chat separately. See, waiting rooms. One sec.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay. Just a sec. Just a sec. Yeah. Okay. Third case detected at a residential complex. Jesus, who's this? Anyway, someone has 3 cases of corona in their residential complex. Please live very, very carefully. Anyway, let's.
My neighbor died.
Oh my God, who's this? Tripati.
Yep. তাদের বাড়ির দুজন family member has also tested positive, but the woman who was 55, she is dead.
Just 55.
Yep. I
Yikes.
think she also had I think তার আগের সপ্তাহে she was admitted to the hospital with a cerebral attack.
On I'm feeling very like well, it's very grim and might actually happen, but I feel like I might never see you again, man. That's not even funny. It's কি রে ঠিক আছিস বেঁচে আছিস I mean not even
স্যার
funny.
আমি বেঁচে আছি, আমি তো পারফেক্ট, আমার থেকে অসম কেউ নেই পৃথিবীতে আমার মনে হচ্ছে এখন।
But seriously মানে একেবারে next door neighbor না?
না না না, জাস্ট দুটো বাড়ি পাশে, মানে আমার পাশের বাড়ির নেক্সট টু ডোর।
So what are you guys doing? Are you in মানে fumigate করা হয়েছে মানে what's going on?
হ্যাঁ, পুরো ডিসইনফেক্ট করা হয়েছে, বাড়ি সিল করে দেওয়া হয়েছে। আমরা যা জানতে পেরেছি, দ্য থিং ইজ কি আমরা তো বাইরে জগৎ থেকে একদমই বিচ্ছিন্ন হয়ে আছি, সো উই রিয়েলি হ্যাড নো আইডিয়া। যেদিনকে মারা গেছে তার পরের দিন আমরা জানতে পেরেছি। সো সিল করে দিয়েছে।
Did she have comorbidity?
সেরিব্রাল অ্যাটাক হয়েছিল and then she was I think admitted to Charnock. ওখানে এখন তো যেই হসপিটালে অ্যাডমিট করা হচ্ছে সেখানেই টেস্ট করা হচ্ছে, so then she tested positive. So yeah, that's that.
Was her death caused by COVID or by something else?
COVID.
Wow, okay, that is scary, Ankita. Listen, I don't know how are you guys managing মানে খাওয়ার ব্যাপারে কি করছিস মানে
সপ্তাহে 4 দিন বলছি, বোধহয় 2 সপ্তাহ টানা আমরা ডিমই খেয়ে যাচ্ছি। মাছ মাংসের জন্য বাইরে বেরোতে এখন ভয় করছে।
না প্লিজ দরকার নেই, you can get by for a while without having much মাংস. But yeah, okay, that's really scary. I'm concerned for you. Take care. ঠিক আছে?
Which area is this?
বেলঘরিয়া।
আচ্ছা।
হ্যাঁ মানে বেলঘরিয়ার কোথায়?
যতীন দাস।
Wait a second. বেলঘরিয়া মানে এই বিটি রোডের এখানে?
Yeah, বেলঘরিয়া যতীন দাস।
That is very close to my house. Very close.
আমি বোপাড়ায় থাকি, আমি জাস্ট মানে উল্টো দিকে।
Very close.
আমি উল্টো দিকে। আমি এটাই ওয়েট করছিলাম মানুষ যদি কখন ইন্টারনেট।
Oh my god.
And she mentioned Charnock is really close to my place.
Yes, it's very close to your house. Yeah. না আমি বেলঘরিয়াটা শোনার জন্য আমি বললাম বেলঘরিয়াটা কোথায়, মানে তার ও যেদিকটা থাকে তার উল্টো দিকে আমি থাকি।
আমিও।
Wait a second.
Yeah.
We are all neighbors and we are all going to die.
Oh my god.
Not yet. No, but listen to me. Listen, guys, take maximum precautions. All right. Mane, ami jeta kori is that I don't go out without. I'm buying a face shield also. If I have to go out, I wear 2 masks, and now I'll wear the face shield. I wear gloves. And when I step back inside the house, at the threshold, I have a sanitizer spray. I absolutely douse every single thing, including groceries, in sanitizer till it's dripping. I change my clothes as well. I put the clothes into a bucket full of Dettol gel. I throw the gloves away in a packet without letting them make contact with anything. The other thing, I don't know if you guys know about this. This is really, I mean, recently jante parlan is that N95 mask na you can't multiple times. You can't use it too many times.
Yes.
Dhule or sanitizer dile kharap hoye jaye. Ability to stop the stuff. Bol.
Where did you ফেস শিল্ড কোথা থেকে কিনেছেন?
আমি এখনো কিনিনি, আজকে
ভাবছি এখানে মেডিকেল স্টোরে। ও আচ্ছা, বিকজ এখানে ইয়েতে কেমিস্টের দোকানে তো রাখে না।
আমার বাবা দুটো পেয়েছে। দ্যাট ইজ বিকজ বাবা চেন্নাই থেকে বাড়িতে এসেছিল 6th of June, and then he also went back তার পরের সপ্তাহেতেই, বাট তখন বাবাকে ফেস শিল্ড দিয়েছিল বিকজ এয়ারপোর্টে এখন বহুত স্ট্রিক্টলি দেখছে সবকিছু।
আমাদের এখানে থার্ড কেস একটা ধরা পড়লো
তো বিল্ডিং এ
কালকে। না না এখন বিল্ডিং এ না, বাট আমাদের রেজিডেন্সিয়াল ইয়েতে কমপ্লেক্সে থার্ড কেস।
And my brother-in-law works with them.
সরি
My brother-in-law is in the Sundarbans actually.
oh
Oh,
like
oh
doing
my
relief work or মানে
God.
Actually, he is the SDO of
Okay,
New
okay.
Alipur. So Mamata Banerjee has sent everybody there. He has dengue cases, he has migrants, he has COVID-19 cases, and he has Amphan cases, all in one high school.
Wow, and in the middle of this we are continuing with our education, but
And the teachers are at a very, very difficult stage. Like all the government teachers, the higher secondary teachers, they have to make food. Like they have been reduced to chefs and waiters rather than teachers at this juncture.
wow folks, I don't know what to say. Anyway, Shon, এটা record হচ্ছে, the file get really big, so we can continue this discussion after the class. So এখনকার জন্য resume করছি. Just know that I'm very concerned and you have to just take as much precaution as you can. ঠিক আছে? Just এই 1-2 মাস এরপরে hopefully একটুখানি improve করবে, but just be precautious. ঠিক আছে? So let's continue because the show must go on, unfortunately. Hold on, slideshow. Beginning. So in this first slide of mine, what I've tried to do is to give you and my former PG2, former PG2 হয়ে গেছে এখন, but তোমরা এটা already একবার দেখেছো, but it's I have basically taken what is perhaps the most difficult essay in all of humanities and boiled it down to a very simple diagram which explains what Bhabha is trying to say in this essay. He says, and you can see this, it's very easily kind of demonstrated, the colonial sign, the colonial book, emerges in a certain point in history and emerges with a certain authenticity and originality and status and importance, all right? The paradigmatic example being the Holy Bible. This status, this importance, the prominence that this book carries in the colonizers' culture naturally leads to people being drawn to it, being allured by it, being interested in it. The natives take this sign as a kind of wonder and they are drawn to it. This leads them to engage with the text, to try and understand it in the terms of their own cultures often, and often they are translated. Every act of translation, this is a basic post-structuralist point. Every kind of repetition is a process of difference, all right? With every repetition of the text, with every copy that is made, it's an imperfect copy, and therefore the originality, the authenticity, the kind of untouchability of this text, the aura which it originally emanates begins to be problematized, all right? Copies are made, every copy is an imperfect copy, the text gets hybridized, and the colonial power is thereby in some sense negotiated with or complicated, all right? So the very authenticity and the very you might say untouchability, the superiority, the difference on which the colonial enterprise is founded, the suggestion that east is east, west is west, never the twain shall meet, is undermined by the process of creating a class of mimics, of people who will engage with your works, with your cultures, and hybridize them, and thereby show that you are not uncopyable, and therefore your power, your status, your culture is not impermeable to influence of us, all right? So that's the basic point that I've shown through this very simple kind of slide. Okay, Bhabha's taken for Bhabha's. So number one, when you tell someone Homi Bhabha, they usually think of this guy on the left, Homi J Bhabha. Please don't be confused. We're talking about Homi K Bhabha.
K Bhabha.
K hoy Homi K Bhabha. Okay. Homi J Bhabha noy. Eta hocche mane J Homi Bhabhar ব্যাপারে ভাবতে সে Homi Bhabha noy. This is Homi K Bhabha. Okay. Homi K Bhabha. Never mind. That's a very lame set of puns. I'm very bored. Honestly, class नहीं तो एक indulging in my puns. Anyway, so don't confuse the two. Though it would be rather apt if you did, because this kind of confusion is precisely what he's talking about. এখানে I'm quoting from Encyclopedia of Postcolonial Studies. Although confused sometimes with India's first nuclear head, Homi J. Bhabha, Homi K. Bhabha, is better known in the West than his illustrious uncle. Okay. Ektukhani bolchi about his life, but I'll kind of tie this in with his ideas as well. I'm very fond, as you can see, of his glasses. I've never seen anything quite like it. So I've written, love the glasses, homie. Never mind. I hope you guys don't share these PPTs because people are going to think you have some very bizarre professors. Anyway, so he was one of the super dons in British Academy when he was teaching at the University of Sussex. A more homely description would see him as one of Midnight's children, one of those born around the time India gained independence in 1947, actively allowing the contamination of diverse traditions in his own life while he theorizes the time of the scattering of the peoples. So therefore, this is important. You have to understand Bhabha as responding in a sense to the diasporic condition. ঠিক আছে? He is like Saib, he is negotiating his own Indianness with his positionality, with his location in the academic cultures, intellectual cultures of the West. And therefore, his work is reflecting this, his own personal journey of negotiating between East and West, okay? Much like someone like Salman Rushdie. He is the he is the editor of the acclaimed collection of essays, Nation and Narration. The publication of The Location of Culture collected most of his seminal essays representing over a decade of work. Bhabha's work is famously difficult, and any paraphrasing of his argument runs the danger of being dismissed as reductive. So I did in my very first slide boil it down to its essence, but I encourage you to read the essay in the original because it's very complex and you may come up with your own interpretations, which I'm always happy to listen to. His work takes us beyond the binary structure of opposition East versus West set up in Edward Said's Orientalism and Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. Okay, even in Fanon, there is this very deeply felt agonistic sense of an encounter between West and East, and Fanon's kind of indignation at his not being recognized as Western because of his skin. All right. But Bhabha moves us beyond that kind of oppositionality in binary terms. So what I've done here, I've sort of made some points. Ritodoshi will be disappointed that there aren't 9 points. There are in fact only 5. But
Sad.
but ekhane I've done a kind of tabular form of trying to understand the basic differences between Said and Bhabha's ideas. On the left you have Said, on the right you have Bhabha. So on the one hand, Said is stressing a kind of binary opposition between East and West. Ironically, because you see, he's railing against it. His point of contention, his bone of contention with colonial discourse is that it is polarized, that it is binary. But at the same time, he himself subscribes, in a sense, to this binary. He seems to be buying into it. Ja Baba. Okay, someone has sent a very clever chat. Okay, so East versus West. Shurab Das has raised hand. Shurab, go ahead. Bolo, unmute kore niye.
No, it just
exercise করছিস
না স্ক্রিনে হাত লেগে গেল ভুল করে
আচ্ছা ঠিক আছে, no problem, you can lower hand. Oh, I can lower your hand. Wow, that's kind of troubling. That's okay, fine. আমি তোর hand lower করে
No, please do that because I have no idea how to lower my hand.
It's like you get stuck there like that. You know how ritual mortification হয় হিন্দু ফকিররা মানে বাবারা অনেক সময় they do this 10 বছর একটা হাত তুলে রাখবে. You guys know about this?
Yeah, heard of it.
Anyway, all right. So where was I? So yeah, now Bhabha on the other hand stresses resistance to binaries. He stresses the interstices of cultures, stresses the irreducible hybridity of cultures. Okay, rigid distinctions such as East-West and colonizer-colonized are difficult to maintain, argues Bhabha. Secondly, on the point of agency, and this is very important, Said's view of colonialism is rather pessimistic in that it seems to grant very little agency to the colonized. And colonialism is seen rather as a kind of one-way process of exercising hegemony. Whereas what does Bhabha say? Bhabha says that colonialism is not a one-way process. He emphasizes resistance to colonialism at the level at least of signification and culture. Now, এটা একটা খুব important and contentious জিনিস. Let's think about this for a while. আমি তোদের স্ক্রিনটা বড় করে দিলাম. See, one of the things that is said about Bhabha as a criticism is that এই যে তুমি agency নিয়ে বলছো, resistance নিয়ে বলছো, is this purely a textual game? Because how much agency was there? I mean, if we did have this kind of agency, why did we not, why did we suffer 200 years of colonialism? At the material level, colonialism seems to have continued despite the ambiguities and complexities of these texts. And this is something that I actually talk about in my PhD thesis. You see, I follow a kind of a reading method that's somewhere in between Said and Bhabha, in which I show that yes, these colonial texts do contain paradoxes, even when they are stressing their own superiority. They seem to suggest how this can be undermined. At many points, you see the native writing back. You can talk about how the colonized at the level of texts, at the level of signification and cultural practices, perhaps, does engage with mimic, parody the colonizer. However, does this negate the material effects of colonialism? No, it doesn't. So, I mean, one of the things I've talked about in my own thesis is how this may actually function as a kind of safety valve. It's a kind of catharsis, perhaps, of energies. At the textual level, at the cultural level, you parody, you mimic, hybridize the colonizers, writ the colonizers' authority. But to what extent does this lend itself to material resistance? It's a complex question, and I'll return to Gandhi I'll go to Gandhi at the end of this lecture if we have time today. But I think Gandhi suggests a way in which this hybridity that Bhabha underlines, it actually steps out of the text and gets written into praxis. Because Gandhi is often thought of as a very kind of, these days there's a kind of liberal backlash against Gandhi. People talk about the kinds of things he did with experiments with his nieces and all of that. You know about all of this. And his belief in caste to someone, he combated caste, but at the same time his thinking about Indian society was quite involved thinking in certain hierarchies and certain distinct categories. Anyway, the point is that Gandhi is a much more hybrid figure than people like to think of these days. He was trained as a barrister. He's trained in certain methods of Western rationality and argument, and he makes a return to an Indian identity. He casts off Western clothes. He, I'm tempted to say, disguises himself as a kind of fakir, in this loincloth. But the reason why he's such a subversive figure is that he's a hybrid figure. He's someone who is able to engage with the colonizer's culture, with the colonizer's ideas, with the colonizer's literature. He spoke English, he wrote English very fluently. And thereby he's this kind of monstrous hybrid creature to the colonizer. That's why he's so threatening. So perhaps Gandhi suggests a way in which hybridity is not merely a textual game, a kind of game that post-structuralists like to play, but it is something that does have, can translate into praxis. Anyway, so that's what Bhabha says. Colonialism is not a one-way process. Emphasis on resistance to colonialism at the level of signification and culture. What Bhabha is trying to achieve is a dynamic of equality between the first and third worlds in terms of representation. So even if in terms of development or in terms of power in the material sense, there is a disjunct, what Bhabha is trying to stress is the equality in terms of representation. No one is God when it comes to representation. Your culture is not immune to subversion, to mimicry, to copying, okay? So the issue of agency then. Number three, on the left you have Said, where you get a sense of colonial power as immutable and secure, as somehow resistant to change. In Bhabha, on the other hand, you get a sense of colonial power as less secure than it presents itself as. Excuse me, less secure than it presents itself to be. He sees it instead as ambivalent and anxious, at least at the level of the written word. All right, the colonial text, at least, presents itself as ambivalent, anxious, riddled with paradoxes, riddled with a sense of its own possible, the possibilities of its subversion are present in the text itself. Okay, so again, it's a kind of deconstructive process of reading that he follows. All right, number 4, on the left you have Said, where you get identities as kinds of essences, all right, stable over time. So it's a sort of tied in with the first point. You might say it's just adding nuance to the first point, where you get a sense of a stable Western identity as a kind of essence. Whereas in Bhabha, you get a sense of shifting, dynamic notions of identity, identity as protean, as shifting, all right? So Bhabha believes it is theoretically innovative and politically crucial to think beyond narratives of originary and initial subjectivities and to focus on those moments or processes that are produced in the articulation of cultural difference. So basically, we shouldn't think of, narratives of originary and initial subjectivity. So, subjectivity isn't something that is authentic, untouchable, original. They're always already hybrid, all right? And we need to focus instead on processes, on moments of translation and transfiguration, okay? Processes and dynamic shifting notions of identity, all right? When cultures come together, when cultures are interlaid onto each other. Number 5, we can talk about the kind of theoretical rooting. Said is rooted in Foucault and Gramsci, older kind of figures. Gramsci, the idea of hegemony, Foucault's kind of discourse analysis, particularly the genealogical analysis, in which truth content is not important. With Bhabha, you move towards more difficult and much more complex ways of thinking about text, post-structuralism, psychoanalysis. His leanings are towards the likes of Derrida and Lacan. All right. So that is a little kind of detour into some differences between Bhabha and Said. We return to learning about Bhabha's journey and life. Achha, incidentally, I can't see the time. When it's 6:40, can someone please unmute yourself and let me know, because I am going to meet the UGs at 6:45, so I can't go on with this class forever. Akhun kota bajche?
6:01.
All right, cool. Okay, so Bhabha in fact reads Fanon against the grain and celebrates the early Fanon of black skin, white masks. In his foreword to that book, he reads Fanon as suggesting that the subjectivities of both parties, East-West, must be seen in their necessarily nuanced and politically ambiguous engagement. So he's reading Fanon against the grain. When you read Fanon, you get this sense of him being outraged towards the West and retreating into a sense of native identity. But he suggests that within this dialectic, you see in fact, a much more complex and interstitial sense of identity emerging, which perhaps Fanon is himself not aware of or invested in articulating. In a Lacanian move, shifting and dynamic notions of identity are put forward such that the familiar alignment of colonial subjects, black, white, self, other, is disturbed, and the traditional grounds of racial identity are dispersed whenever they are found to rest in narcissistic myths of negritude or white cultural supremacy. The more one tries to stress the purity of identities, the more the purity is fragmented. Interestingly, I think this is a very interesting historical juncture to be doing Bhabha in. Because, ever since, Black Lives Matters has been going on for a long time, but with this recent upsurge ever since George Floyd's murder, we are once again, I think, and perhaps controversially, I will say, that we are once more retreating, or not retreating, but perhaps progressing. The point is that there is a polarization happening, and perhaps it's important. You have to remember that even the LGBT movement began with the Stonewall riots. That you need to oppose, and in order to oppose at a political level, you do need identity. You do need to you do need to cluster together and sort of uh, gather around certain banners of identity, and blackness is one of them. And it's not imaginary either. You know, it's written into various cultural practices, from the forms we fill up, or the forms that Americans will have to fill up. You know, even if you've applied for a visa, or if you've applied for a passport, you'll see you know have to say, Acha, what is your ethnicity, etc. All right. So these things exist, and currently we are seeing this kind of very polarized and very contentious battle, really, between you know, blackness and a sense of whiteness. And Tumra, has anyone been following the Priyamvada Gopal controversy recently? Anyone? Unmute yourself and join the conversation if you have. Does anyone know about Professor Priyamvada Gopal in Cambridge University? No? Okay, I'll fill you in on that. What's happening is that so Priyamvada Gopal is a post-colonial, very famous post-colonial scholar who's been working in Cambridge for several decades. And you know, she has a very kind of controversial Twitter account. She writes some very kind of incendiary things once in a while. I'm quite disturbed by the you know, the regression, I would say, of academic cultures into Twitter, because you know the problem, it's a very, I don't know, it's a, even Facebook, you know, there's a tendency to fall into camps, into tribal thinking. It becomes us versus them. And I'm caught, you know, I myself am caught between understanding the importance of opposition in order to fight structural racism. You need to uh, clump together under a shared black identity. But at the same time, what does this do? How does this affect academia and the intellectual life? Because I would think that we are invested in approaching culture and identity as perhaps more complex, and perhaps you know, binary thinking is something that we are somewhat skeptical of. Anyway, Tani Onek Bhabajay, Priyamvada Gopal wrote a tweet saying that white lives don't matter, full stop, as white lives. So what she meant is not that the lives of white people don't matter, they should die, but the category or the idea of whiteness should be gradually dissolved and erased. Okay. But Kiholo is that this led to a huge controversy. People started calling her racist. There were petitions signed. Some thousands of people signed a petition, sent it to Cambridge University saying, sack this person, she's a racist, etc., etc. Cambridge University wonderfully backed up their professors' freedom of speech and expression, uh, saying that we will categorically, under all circumstances, defend our faculty members' rights to speech and expression. Uh, and so she's not been sacked. In fact, she got promoted. To full professor. Lots to think about there. Anyway, so let's get back to this discussion about Homi Bhabha. Okay, but I think it's a very interesting moment to look at a post-structuralist like Bhabha. What do we get? What do we lose from complicating binary identities in a moment like ours in history? Okay. Bhabha identifies a paradox at the heart of the West's imperial enterprise of supposedly not brining modernity. Oh my God. Salting. Does anyone know what brine means? You should know what brine means. Anyone? Unmute yourself.
Sea salt.
Yeah, brine is salt. Supposedly brining modernity to the rest of the world. That's interesting. Does the West brine salt modernity to the rest of the world? Anyway, let's not go into that kind of flighty poetic interpretation. So Bhabha identifies the paradox at the heart of the West's imperial enterprise of supposedly bringing modernity to the rest of the world. And here is the paradox. The legitimating postulate of colonial discourse in Bhabha's formulation is the notion of time lag, of extending the project of modernization to areas outside the West. So the colonial enterprise is premised on the idea that we are modern, you are not, we are civilized, you are savage. There is a time lag between your culture and ours, and we are bringing, the white man's burden, the light of civilization and modernity will be brought to your country, right? That is the justification for the colonial enterprise. In the discursive arrangement that colonialism constructs, the tutelage and responsibility for this mission are Europe's. The non-West, by this catalytic intervention, is to hurry up its evolutionary refinement, its journey from the state of nature to that of culture, to become a mirror image of its benefactor. This agenda, which colonialism sets up for itself, places it in an embarrassingly paradoxical position. The transformation of the non-West into a clone of the West would, of course, render the whole project nonsensical, dissolving any sustainable distinction between the West and the rest. Okay, do you get it? Think about it. I'll make it very simple. I'll give you a little diagram. Can you see this
Excuse me, sir.
diagram? Yeah, go ahead.
Sir, this is Ruksha. Sir, there is this a paper by Shibu Soren on this Santhal Hul. It's about the role of women in the Santhal Hul. So, okay, will you please allow me to go
Yes, please go ahead.
this?
Yeah, sure, Ruksha, go ahead. I know
Okay, thank you, sir.
but I'll just finish this class. But yeah, go ahead. See you. Bye.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Bye, sir.
Where was I? So yeah, the paradox then. Look, I'll make it really simple for you, okay? Look at the left. Colonialism is sustained by a narrative of bringing modernity, which is premised on this gap, the supposed gap between a modern developed West and an undeveloped backward East. But colonialism also says, become like us. We will make you like us, which would remove the gap and the logic sustaining colonialism. So it is an enterprise which undermines itself. It says that I am here, and my presence is justified because I'm civilized and you're savage, I'm modern and you're not. But I'm going to make you like me. And in so doing, I'm going to remove the very premise, the very justification for my being there in the first place, you understand? So this is one of the many paradoxes in the colonial enterprise that Bhabha is invested in outlining. Here is one more, and this I take from Shumit Chakraborty's exercise essay, moving beyond Edward Said, Homi Bhabha, and the problem of post-colonial representation. And he says, the difference between othering and knowability. Sumit Chakraborty says, whereas the consistent othering of the colonized is used to situate the West in a position of binary superiority, the complete knowability of visibility of the subject people is also assumed, as if the paradigms of Western systems of knowledge have managed to know or read the other completely. So on the one hand, it says that you are other, you are essentially different, okay? But in the process of colonizing you, your knowledge systems are made visible. We read it, us the colonizers read it and absorb it and understand it. Therefore, on what grounds can you say that they are other or completely essentially different? You understand? So there are a number of these paradoxes that beset the colonizing enterprise. Now, let's talk about some of the key concepts in Bhabha's work. Let's talk first about mimicry. And here I've given you a very simple visual representation of mimicry, the 19th century colonial Babu, a Bengalese Babu. This is an unknown artist. It's from the Mary.
So I'm really sorry to interrupt. Can I please have a glimpse of the previous slide?
Sure. I'll share the PPT with you anyway. So
okay.
Don't worry, you don't have to copy it down right now.
No, I'm not copying, just reading it.
So I'll share the PPT.
Okay, sir, fine.
Sure. So ektukhani tatari I have to move because I want to wrap this up before 6:45. So mimicry. Mimicry is a strategy that results from misreadings of colonial discourse and power by the colonized subject. So Science Taken for Wonders will talk about precisely this mimicry. As the colonized performs according to the protocol of the colonizer, he or she inevitably is both the same and different. This gap between the two positions unsettles the power of the colonizer, for at the same time that the colonized subject appears to participate in the imperialistic regime, he or she also misappropriates and misrepresents the dictates of colonial discourse. This tension creates a site of resistance. Bhabha notes that the performance of mimicry is marked by ambivalence. As mimicry stages an ambivalent response to the other, it also challenges its authority, and in this case, mimicry repeats rather than represents. So the basic point is, I come and say to you that I am different from you, I am superior to you, my culture is authentic, untouchable, etc. You, on the other hand, will engage with my culture, you will mimic me, copy me like a colonial babu, and in so copying, disprove any kind of essential difference between us and challenge the authority of your culture and your signifying systems through this process of mimicry. All right. Now I'm getting a lot of background noises from WhatsApp. I'm just going to stop share for a moment here. Close my WhatsApp. Sorry about that. Right. Screen share. Okay, we are back. You should be seeing this PPT again. Can you see my PPT? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, great. So, right, so that's the basic idea, all right? You mimic, you copy, and in copying, you show that the colonizer is not beyond subversion through mimicry, okay? Bhabha suggests that the structure of mimicry derives from a fundamental but unstable urge on the part of colonial authority. On the one hand, there must be intermediaries or collaborators with whom the colonial power can work in the exercise of its authority. On the other, these intermediaries come to seem a little too similar to the colonizer, undermining ideologies of superiority. Okay, so it's a very simple idea. Underneath all this knot of complexity, the basic ideas of Bhabha are very simple. আমি বলছি যে তুমি আর আমি একেবারে আলাদা, আমি সুপিরিয়র, তুমি ইনফিরিয়র, কিন্তু তোমাকে শাসন করতে গেলে, তোমাকে রুল করতে গেলে, I have to create this class of intermediaries, collaborators. The collaborators are encouraged, a la Macaulay's minute, to copy the colonizer's culture, to absorb the values, absorb the language, absorb the signifying systems of the colonizer. In so doing, it becomes a disturbingly similar double of the colonizer, and thereby undermines the possibility of the superiority and the inviolability of the culture and the signifying systems of the colonizer. Okay. A further consequence of mimicry is the undermining of the colonizer's apparently stable original identity. The identity of the colonizer is constantly slipping away, being undermined by effects of writing, joking, sly civility. Sly civility is sort of where you pretend to khub ekta babu bhabe you're civil, but in that act, in that performance, you are, there is a, it's disingenuous, and therefore it's sly, and it's a kind of mockery. All right. And repetition. These effects are apparently unconscious, but at the same time might become strategies of resistance to work alongside more direct and explicit action. Okay, sorry for the tide of information on this slide. I haven't done the point-by-point appearing thing. But okay, let's now talk about ambivalence. Now, the first thing I'll warn you is that ambivalence in Bhabha is an ambivalent term. Okay, it's not simple. It involves multiple kinds of complexity, and it's to some extent open to interpretation. So I'll give you some interpretations here. In a nutshell, ambivalence in Bhabha's sense means the uncertainties, paradoxes, and tensions that make colonial discourse a slippery terrain. So it's a term first developed in psychoanalysis to describe a continual fluctuation between wanting one thing and wanting its opposite. It also refers to a simultaneous attraction towards and repulsion from an object, person, or action. Adapted into colonial discourse theory by Homi Bhabha, It describes the complex mix of attraction and repulsion that characterizes the relationship between colonizer and colonized. So this is only one, this, by the way, this is only one reading or one aspect of ambivalence. But this aspect is the aspect of the simultaneity of attraction and repulsion. The colonizer is, in a sense, attracted to or interested in the colonized, but also repelled, okay, disavowing the colonized. Similarly, the colonized is attracted to the culture of the colonizer, but also trying to resist it. So the relationship is ambivalent because the colonized subject is never simply and completely opposed to the colonizer. Rather than assuming that some colonized subjects are complicit and some resistance, ambivalence suggests that complicity and resistance exist in a fluctuating relation within the colonial subject. So there are moments of complicity, moments of resistance. The two are very complexly interwoven. Ambivalence also suggests, ambivalence also characterizes the way in which colonial discourse relates to the colonized subject. For it may be both exploitative and nurturing, or represent itself as nurturing at the same time. So this means that colonial discourse itself is very complex. There are times when it seems to be negating, or it seems to be exploitative. There are other times when it seems to be nurturing, presenting itself as is benevolent, benign. All right, and I'll show you some examples of this from my thesis to make it clear, because I am invested in this kind of outlining the ambivalence of colonial discourse in my thesis, okay? But most importantly, in Bhabha's theory, however, ambivalence disrupts the clear-cut authority of colonial domination because it disturbs the simple relationship between colonizer and colonized. Ambivalence is therefore an unwelcome aspect of colonial discourse for the colonizer. The problem for colonial discourse is that it wants to produce compliant subjects who reproduce its assumptions, values, and habits, that is, mimic the colonizer. But instead it produces ambivalent subjects whose mimicry is never very far from mockery. Ambivalence describes this fluctuating relationship between mimicry and mockery, an ambivalence that is fundamentally unsettling to colonial dominance. In this respect, it is not necessarily disempowering for the colonial subject, but rather can be seen to be ambivalent or two-powered. The effect of this ambivalence, the simultaneous attraction and repulsion, is to produce a profound disturbance of the authority of colonial discourse. So, অনেক কিছুই বলা হচ্ছে এখানে. You're talking about the complex mix of attraction and repulsion on the part of colonizer and colonized. You're talking about a fluctuation between complicity and resistance. You're also talking about how the complexities of colonial discourse allow for the mimicry and mockery of the colonizer, of the colonized. All right. Now, all of this is rather it might seem a little vague. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a couple of examples from my own PhD thesis. But for this, I'm going to have to hunt for my thesis. I've stopped share. Incidentally, I'll just be back. I just need to do one thing really quickly. Just give yourself a 1 minute break. I'll just be back. Yeah. Yeah, sorry about that. Right, yeah. Where was I? Okay. So I'm going to demonstrate some aspects of ambivalence. Remember that it's a very rather complex term and can be interpreted in many ways. Essentially, we're talking about certain certain paradoxes, ambivalences, complexities in colonial discourse. A discourse that, according to Said, tries to posit a binary difference between East and West actually emerges as far more complex and fractured. Okay, so I'll give you two examples. One example of complexity that I will give you, or of ambivalence that I'll give you, is the ambivalence between the supposed confidence and assertiveness of colonial discourse and its awareness of its own fragility and failure. Okay, so in order to show you this, I'm just going to go to one section of my PhD thesis. I'm sorry, by now people are probably convinced that I'm narcissistic, but it's just the fact is that when it comes to certain things, I uh, I do this, I talk about this. It's just been 2 years since my PhD, so I'm familiar with this work that I've done. That's why I want to show it to you. It's a good illustration of some of the ambivalences of colonial discourse. Okay, so I'm going to show you a little passage where I describe a very interesting moment in the history of the evangelical Baptist mission in India, in Bengal, namely the conversion of Krishnopal, one of the earliest converts to Christianity within the British presence. It was in, so as you know, in the early part. Acha, am I audible, by the way? Hello?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
So until about 1820 or 30, probably, I've forgotten the exact date, missionary activity was actually forbidden in British parts of India because uh, the British were afraid of disturbing native religious ideas and stirring up a rebellion, which in fact does happen with the Vellore Mutiny in 1806 and later 1857 because of, about that, the caste marks and the greased cartridges. But Protheme it wasn't allowed. ঠিক আছে? So the missionaries had to settle, that the British missionaries did come here, but had to settle in non-British parts of India. So Shirampur, which was Danish, I think, at the time, is where they settled, Carey, Marshman, and Ward. And they started their conversion. They started proselytizing. It was a very flawed and fraught enterprise to start with. So I just want to give you a sense of that, of the supposed kind of confidence and authority and superiority of colonial difference, becoming aware of its own possibilities of failure. And so I'll just read you this section on Krishnopal from my thesis, if I can find it. Just hold on. I'll probably have to end after this because I don't have enough time. Krishnopal. Okay, very good. All right. Okay, now I'll just do screen share. Are you guys seeing my screen at the moment? No, no? Okay, you should be seeing my screen now. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm reading from here. Okay, I'm talking about a narrative that is there in the life and times of Carey, Marshman, and Ward by John Clark Marshman. Okay, where he's recounting the early presence of the Baptists in Shirampur, who were convinced of their own superiority, who were convinced of their religion and its power, and the inevitability of their triumph in a sense. But let's just read this account and see what emerges. So Marshman recounts the conversion of Krishnopal, William Carey's first convert, on 28 December 1800. As a prelude to this evening, John Thomas, another missionary at the fledgling Baptist mission at Shirampur, has begun to lose the balance of his mind. You have to understand, I'll just pause here, that the conditions that they were working in were inhospitable, inhuman, okay, terrible, terribly high temperatures. These are people who've come from a temperate climate and they're facing 45-degree heat, mangrove forests, not mangrove forest. Shirampur is just regular forests. But, you know, mosquitoes, heat, malaria, cholera, dense population, okay? And it's shocking and it's difficult, and their enterprise seems to be failing. And so John Thomas is going mad at this time. One of the missionaries in the Shirampur mission has begun to lose the balance of his mind when his first potential convert, after 17 years of fruitless labor, disappears. It so happens that his first convert 17 বছর ধরে খেটে গেছে, please Baba convert karo, please believe. Suddenly this fellow just disappears, goes off back to his native village. And so John Thomas starts to lose his mind. He has been incoherently raving blasphemies for days. William Carey's wife Dorothy too, faced with intolerable heat, inscrutable natives, and children dying of malaria, has lost her sanity. She is confined to a room. In this atmosphere of deep gloom, some consolation is found when Krishnopal, another Indian, announces his...
That's it.
A lecture is getting hybridized. To mute kuchi সবাই, can I do it?
আরে আমার এই সাদা ইয়ারফোনসটা গেছে।
ইব্রানি, একটু নিজেকে মিউট করবি প্লিজ? Hello. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, okay. So where was I? So Carrie's wife Dorothy is confined to a room, and she is also losing her mind. In this atmosphere of deep gloom, some consolation is found when Krishnopal, another Indian, announces his intention to convert. However, the public profession of a foreign creed and the entire abandonment of all social and family ties creates a sensation in Shirampur, and an angry mob of 2,000 Indians surround his house. Krishnopal, however, remains firm to his resolution. The next morning, Sunday, the 28th of December, the ordinance of baptism was performed under circumstances the most solemn and distressing. The missionaries assembled with the congregation in the chapel, and Mr. Carey walked down to the river with his eldest son, about to be baptized, and Krishna on the other side of him. So you look at the interstitiality of this Krishnopal figure. I'm trying to point out that in trying to convert someone, in trying to, you know, inaugurate someone into a foreign culture's practices, you know, this leads to all kinds of subversive potential, okay? Krishnopal becomes a kind of monstrous figure who is threatening to his own community, and this leads to resistance, and this leads to, you know, a lot of trouble in Shirampur. So the next morning, anyway, this happens, and they go to the river in this atmosphere of doom and gloom and things failing and people going mad. Mr. Thomas, who was confined to his couch, made the air resound with his blasphemous ravings, and Mrs. Carey, shut up in her own room on the opposite side of the path, poured forth the most painful shrieks. Okay, so it's almost a kind of apocalyptic scene that's going on. Though Marshman's account is published in the mid-19th century, it describes the year 1800 and testifies both to the liminal position of British missionaries occupied in the early 19th centuries and the dangers of religious intervention. Dangers that would erupt in 1806 at the Vellore Mutiny. So what I'm trying to say is that this text of the colonizer, the life and times of Carey, Marshman and Ward, which is a text that is dedicated to, or a text that is involved in trying to show how the light of the West, the light of Christianity, is being shed on the natives, is fraught, is deeply marked by ambivalence, uncertainty, anxiety, and all of this becomes evident when you read these accounts of conversion, okay? So that's one kind of ambivalence that I wanted to show you. The other kind that I want to talk about, and here I'll show you one more kind of paradox in colonial discourse, again from my thesis, page 221 to 20, let me see. 21. Can you still see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Okay. So I am going to be talking about a figure called James Peggs. Okay. James Peggs, and don't look at the screen right now, just listen to me. James Peggs is another missionary. Okay. He is working in Orissa, in Cuttack, and in Puri as well, and he's also trying to convert the heathens. And see, the problem in this book, in my 5th chapter, I look at a book called India's Cries to British Humanity, which is a kind of it's a kind of interventionist literature. It's also kind of fundraising material. It's written for British audiences, asking them to contribute monetarily to the cause of the mission in Cuttack. And in order to do so, it outlines Hinduism as this religion of terrors, okay? Terrors and horrors, where all kinds of things happen, from sati to female infanticide to something called ghat murders. Just a sec. Sorry about this. Just keep on the table. I'll come in 10 minutes. I'm taking a class. Sorry. Yeah. So it presents Hinduism as this barbaric, savage religion of terrors, of things like infanticide, sati, ghat murders. Ghat murders is the dying person would be taken to the banks of the Ganga and allegedly buried in the mud to, that's supposed to sort of to give certain karmic benefits. All right. Now, my interest in these texts. Hold on a second. Just one second. So there is an ambivalence in this text that I try to highlight. ठीक है? And you see, because this text is caught up between a politics of sympathizing and a politics of negation. On the one hand, it's trying to say these poor Hindus, these suffering Hindus, we need to sympathize with them. We need to save them, basically. But at the same time, it is so invested in, it's so thoroughly saturated in a disgust towards the native, in a disgust towards their religion, towards their identity, that it's also invested in a kind of negation. You understand? So there is an irresolvable paradox, a tension between identification and negation, sympathizing and sympathy and antipathy. So let me just read you a little extract there. So I've summed it up here. Finally, if sympathy depended first and foremost on the awakening of interest in an object, to what extent is Peggs able to do this? Much of the, okay, that's a separate point. Much of the work is comprised of dry reportage fact statistics, all right. No, the more important point that I'm trying to make is this. Hang on. Just a second. Okay, the text also relies, okay, hold on, again. Right, we can explain the shift away from sympathy towards what Rudd calls sympathy as antipathy in Peggs by locating India's cries within a broader history of India in the literature of sympathy. Okay, hang on, this is not the section that hang on, let me just, sorry about this. 220 to 21. Okay, sorry, I've gone to the wrong page. 220, 21. Okay. Right. Okay. So, secondly, within the theoretical underpinnings of the notion of sympathy in his own times, Peggs would be expected to negotiate the problem of cultural difference as well. In order to strike at the vitals of the sense of self, the author would need to suggest a common humanity between Indians and Britons that would negate the wide gulf of cultural difference. So he's trying to say that these people are also human beings. We need to sympathize with them. We need to save them. As we have noted throughout our close reading, Peggs is less successful in this regard since he essentializes and demonizes Hindus. Although in other places he didactically states that a common humanity exists between the two, the rhetoric of negation goes a long way to undermine these assertions. Okay? Further, cultural difference could only be negotiated by a process of translation in the figurative sense. In order to do this, a common ground between cultures must be found. Okay, here I'm talking about other people. So basically, I hope you understood the basic point I'm trying to make is that in James Peggs, as well as in other colonial writers, you have a tension between sympathy and identification and negation and antipathy, all right, hatred, othering. So these are some of the tensions, ambivalences, and paradoxes that deeply inform colonial texts. And this is part of what Bhabha describes as ambivalence of colonial discourse. Okay, and now I'm tired. This has been a long lecture. I'm losing my voice, and I have another class to take. So unfortunately, we'll have to have one last lecture, a very short one. It'll take 20 minutes maximum, but we'll do that tomorrow. ঠিক আছে? So unmute করলাম সবাইকে if you have any issues, questions. Okay, I'm unfortunately going to have big questions tomorrow, Baba. Yeah, Genia, do you have a question? Anyway, listen, I have to go because I have to eat something. I'm hungry, and after that I have another class. So I'll see you guys tomorrow then. All right?
Okay, sir.
Yeah.
Sir,
What time? Let's do 4 o'clock tomorrow. All right, everyone. 4 o'clock tomorrow.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Bye.